Okay. Hearing none, the recording has started so that we can share that. So, and Catherine mentioned it, but thank you to Ken Lewis at Red Deer County for initially getting the ball rolling to set this up. So, how do we do outreach from within our little bubbles? It might not be as simple as this game of telephone that we used to play as kids with the cups. There's lots of benefits, though, of doing remote outreach. So in a lot of ways, this could be a real silver lining and an opportunity for us to pilot a lot of creative solutions that maybe have been sitting percolating in the back burners, but we have not tested out and tried out, maybe because we have some assumptions that they're not going to work, or we just don't have the access to the technology or the skills. So this is a great opportunity for us to learn those skills as extension staff, but also for our clients and our outreach audience to learn some of these skills as well. So lots of benefits. Number one is that remote outreach can be open to all. There's no barriers in terms of geography and that kind of thing. We can share those resources much more easily, especially if we're recording them. The sort of time limitations for people don't necessarily disappear, but they're ameliorated. It can help us build community through potentially engaging more frequently. So whereas it may have been more difficult to get people to in-person events because they needed to take a half day out of their life, they might be willing to jump on a webinar or something like that, perhaps more frequently. It can be less expensive if you're looking at things like trying to host tours and lunch and learns and things like that, where you're buying a meal, you're buying paying for a bus, all of those kinds of things. Even if you have to pay for a little bit of software or technology to try to deliver these things, it still is likely going to end up being less expensive for you. We can also measure results in a lot of different ways, and Laura's going to talk more about that. But a lot of the tools that we use have built-in measurement capabilities that can help us. You can easily add on calls to action. So if you're a nonprofit, for example, you could add on a donate here button, or if you want them to fill out after your webinar or your outreach event, you want them to go ahead and start filling out their environmental farm plan, you can have a link to that and that kind of thing. It's also easier to bring a friend. So again, it's one of those situations where they don't have to take that time out of their day. They can easily share it. And if you've recorded the content, if they're sitting in your session going, gee, so-and-so would really like to hear this, I think, they can share that with them after the session. They're also arguably more environmentally friendly if you're talking about things like carbon footprint of people trying to drive long distances and things like that. And one of the things that I like about it is it does make in-person meetups that much more special. So when you do finally get together again, you're going to be really happy to see those people. Now, there are always pros and cons of just about everything. Some of the challenges of remote outreach, I'm sure, are top of mind for a lot of you. The things I've been hearing mostly in terms of people's concerns have been access to internet in our rural world. We still don't have a lot of great rural internet connectivity in a lot of places. So that can be an issue. In addition to that, even in quote unquote really good internet service areas, some of the servers may be overloaded. So for instance, we're using Zoom today. They're having huge increases in people trying to use their service. So, if some of these platforms can't keep up to the demand, their servers may be overloaded. We also might have lack of technical knowledge, either ourselves as the people who might need to deliver this kind of content, but also as the audience that we're hoping to deliver the content to. lack of instant feedback. So, it's kind of like the difference between being on a conference call versus being in person, right? Something like 90% of communication is nonverbal. It's body language, it's eye contact, and those kinds of things. And when we lose those, even a little bit, it really does affect how we perceive people are perceiving what we're saying, right? So that can be a challenge. Certainly things like these Zoom calls where you can kind of see a face here and there helps a little bit, but it doesn't completely eliminate that challenge. And some people just don't want to share their webcams. I notice a lot of you aren't on webcam today, and that's fine. We have lots of different reasons for that. Sometimes it's a bandwidth issue for our internet. Sometimes it's that we're sitting in our bathrobe, or the kids making a mess in the background, or whatever. No problems. But that is an issue sometimes for people. And you have to have a good moderator as well to make sure that any kind of those technical glitches can be dealt with immediately. And they can be less engaging. Like, let's be honest, how many of you are checking your email right now, or scrolling Pinterest, or petting the dog, or dealing with your kids, or whatever? That's just kind of the nature of the beast sometimes. And sometimes there can be limitations on some of the free services out there, and paid services might be a little bit out of our price range too. So we'll start off with a little bit of a poll to get people engaged. I'm going to ask, what is your biggest concern about doing your outreach work remotely right now? So, and it is multiple choice. So if you have a couple of different things that are really weighing heavily, you can select more than one answer. And if you guys hear a little bit of snoring coming from my my speakers here, I promise it's not me, it's the dog who has very loud snores laying right by my feet. All right, it looks like most people have voted. There's a couple people who haven't, so I'll just give it maybe 3 more seconds here. Okay. All right, so not surprisingly, we've run this session a couple of times now, and the answers are usually more or less the same. So interest from participants continues to be number one. How interested is our audience going to be in this kind of platform, whether it's a webinar or other forms of outreach? And then their technical capabilities. Either that might be their software or their hardware limitations, or perhaps knowledge limitations, either way. And then your own technical capabilities is following pretty close. So that's why you're here, right? So I want to mention, like I said, this is kind of that 10,000 foot overview. It's a really quick flyby introduction to some of these topics. We can't obviously cover everything, but there is a lot of interest, both from our organizations and from others, in trying to provide more resources to extension staff. So we really want to know what resources will be helpful to you. There should be a follow-up survey coming out after this, and we'd really love to hear from you. You can also use that chat box to share with us even now the kinds of, or throughout the presentation, the kinds of things that you would like a deeper dive in, or specific training on. And I'm seeing some some chats in the chat box too. Biggest challenge working from home with kids. The thought of hosting a webinar with them at home is terrifying. Yes, I agree. I have mine locked in the bedroom with my partner right now, along with the noisy dog, just so that we can do this. But yeah, that's a challenge. So our first session on Monday, or last week, sorry, was focusing on working from home and remote outreach solutions and some tips and tricks to deal with that. So if you didn't tune into that, I think Catherine will probably send out the link along with everything else after this call. So you might want to take a look at some of those resources if you haven't yet, Melissa. And Amy said, making sure that people know where to look. Normal advertising may not catch people. Absolutely. That's something that we'll talk about some more. And it's one of the things that has kind of come up as potentially a future resource as well. So that's gone now. Okay. So how can we address some of these challenges? Well, first of all, I think it's important to just remember not to overcomplicate things. I think a lot of people get really nervous thinking, oh my God, I have to have all this equipment and things like that. Really, all that's needed these days is a laptop or even just a smartphone and some kind of an internet connection. So that might be your actual wired or wireless internet connection, but it also could be on your mobile phone. So 5G or whatever. Because a lot of these apps do work on mobile. So even in places that we don't have good, stable, like wired internet access, we can still get really decent cell coverage. So it's going to use up more data, but also a lot of data plans are getting cheaper. And I think a lot of the people that are in those sketchier internet zones probably do have decent data plans on their phones already. So it may be an issue. It may be less of an issue than we think in some cases. But knowing what those limitations or skills of your audience are is a really great place to start, and what their preferences or familiarity is with different platforms. But I don't think we want to assume. I think we need to be asking people and experimenting and give them a chance to learn too. So although we want to meet them at their level and where they're at, I think people also do appreciate a chance to learn new skills. And the nice thing is at this time, this is the whole world encouraging people to make some moves in these directions. So it's not that they're trying to conform to what we're trying to tell them in extension. Likely they're getting the same kinds of requests from their church or their kids' school or whatever the case may be. So I think we can take advantage of some of that momentum. But one really effective way of trying to get people there is to just build in baby steps and give them that chance to learn. So, for example, if you're going to host a webinar, you could also offer a simple call-in option. So a lot of the platforms do allow just where people can dial in and use a phone. It won't have access to the screen share and things like that, of course, but it's one step. And then maybe next time they'll log on and try to see the screen while they call in. And then maybe next time they'll show their video and stuff like that. So all that said, although we're going to focus on the things that are new to everybody because that's where we need to provide that resource, I think, the classics never die. I mean, everybody knows how to use their telephone. A lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people do have email and that kind of thing. Our regular mail outs and newspaper ads, all of those kinds of things are tried and true. They're still options this year. You could even add on to those handwritten letters or notes. And then more expensive options, but radio, television, all of those kinds of things are still available and may work in your demographics. Slightly updated from there, there's also things that people are pretty familiar with and they're fairly basic. Text messages. A lot of the producers I talk to prefer a text message to an email or a phone call these days. A lot of organizations have e-newsletters, or it might be a good time to start one. social media, blog posts, all of those pieces. And you might consider this a chance to up the ante and experiment with a few different things. So maybe you start a YouTube channel or experiment with paid social media ads and things like that in terms of trying to get that knowledge out to your audience and do some of that advertising that Amy was saying earlier. And one tip with those kinds of things is that short videos with tidbit-sized info tend to be better received and viewed more often than long pieces of content. So getting somebody to sit down and watch an hour webinar, they have to be fairly committed, but they will likely watch a 1-minute video or 30-second video on their phone as they're scrolling their social media feed or something like that. So an aside, just because we're mentioning social media here, I think it's worth noting that social media needs to be very responsive to whatever situation is going on at the moment. And clearly we have a large global situation going on. So Alice Canada has specifically changed our social media strategy, and just kind of sharing it in case it's helpful to any of you. The recognition is that, you know, business as usual may not work. Sort of those promotional kinds of posts just don't seem to be received very well these days. And we just need to be aware of the situation. You know, what's the fear level? What's everybody dealing with? That kind of thing. Scheduled posts get noticed a million miles away. Like I noticed, called out one, it was a funder actually that I follow, and clearly they hadn't updated these scheduled posts because they were advertising in-person events, which had definitely been canceled quite a while earlier. And on that note, you know, photos that depict group gatherings right now might be ill-timed. Obviously depends on your situation and how you're phrasing the post, but people are a little bit more sensitive to that kind of thing. So if you're sharing like a memory or something of an event in the past, I probably wouldn't post a group photo unless it's got a really specific reason behind it, or you're at least kind of recognizing the situation along with it. And we're just trying to be really empathetic and focus on the positive as we go. So, okay, if you want to step it up one more notch past those sort of, call them middle line options, you can certainly host webinars like this. Live webinars are great because you can have some interaction and some discussion, but you can also host them on demand. So as I mentioned, recording things is a fantastic tool in your toolbox because you'll have those pieces available to share in a number of different capacities. It might be taking out that little 1-minute snippet to post on your social media feed, or it might be offering it to somebody who couldn't attend in person. But I'll also add that creating an on-demand webinar is a good way for us as extension staff to ease into doing these kinds of things too. So it can be really daunting if you've never hosted one of these before, to sit here and try to talk basically to yourself for an hour. If you have the chance to kind of just pre-record it, make sure you're happy with it and that kind of thing, and then put that content out there, that could be your baby step to get in to doing these kinds of things. You can also do one-on-one webcam conversations. As I mentioned, that body language is really important. So, you know, you can pick up the phone and have that one-on-one conversation with the farmer or whoever you're trying to talk to. But it's that much better even if you can get them to hop on a Zoom call or Hangouts call or FaceTime or whatever. And then you can actually see their face. It's amazing how much of a difference it makes. You might also consider things like podcasts or creating an online community for your audience. So in those cases, I would recommend going with whatever they're kind of using already. So maybe a Facebook group or a LinkedIn group or something like that. But there's lots of other specific tools like Slack and Mobilize and do website forums and things like that. Call-in resources is more along the lines of, for those of us that remember, calling in to find out what time the movies are scheduled. You know, Transformers at 7 o'clock and Dracula at 8:30, whatever. We could potentially do the same kind of thing. If you have something that is a frequently asked question, people are just kind of calling, where can I get this resource, that kind of thing. You could create like a voicemail sort of system where they can get that information. Press 1 for environmental farm plan information, press 2 for Alice program information, that kind of thing. I use line2.com as an option for one of my hobbies, and it works pretty well. It's just like an online phone platform, so that's an option. Watch parties we'll talk about in a little bit, and chatbots. Is it similar to those call-in resources? It's a chance to basically make sure that you're responsive to your audience. So if somebody messages your Facebook page at midnight on Saturday, chances are you're not going to be responding for at least 24 hours. Longer than that, I don't know how to do math. A chatbot at least can give them the basic information. Oh, you want the link to the environmental farm plan? Click here, that kind of thing. The note with chatbots is that you want to make sure that a real person really does respond to people, though as soon as they can. So kind of glossed over, but mentioned podcasts. I think they're a really good opportunity right now, you know, whether it's starting your own or jumping on one that exists, like Rural Roots to Climate Solutions podcast. They're local and certainly topic appropriate. A lot of these kinds of content producers are looking for content to put out there, and the easier we can make it for them, the more likely it is that they will include it in their platform for us. So just a few general tips. You know, first and foremost, I think we want to reduce barriers whenever possible. So if we can use what they're already using, great. You know, if you're trying to set up a call with somebody and they already know how to use FaceTime, don't force them to use Zoom if you know how to use FaceTime, right? See if you can meet them where they're at on that side of things. As much as possible, make things click a link, like one action that people have to do. The more things, if they have to go and download software and then go to this website and then enter a password and blah, 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 they're probably going to find that more daunting. If they can click a link, there's a much higher chance that they'll actually participate. So a good example of this, if you're having farmers who are, or audience who are resistant to trying to get onto like a live webinar or something like this, we've mentioned already recording your content and then uploading it to YouTube. YouTube makes it really easy because most people are familiar with it, and again, all they need is that link. They don't need anything fancy, and they can be watching it immediately. Virtual events too aren't that much different in terms of actually running them than your in-person events, except you're not worrying about lunch and meeting the caterer outside and that kind of thing. You still need somebody to host and moderate the event, and it's really great if you can have 2 people for that. So Catherine, for example, is being awesome and moderating today. So she's watching the chat box, she's letting people in who are joining late and that kind of thing. Really, really helps so that your speaker doesn't have to get distracted with those kinds of things. Inviting great speakers. This is our great opportunity to access speakers that we wouldn't have normally been able to access for our in-person events. So as an example, you might hear of somebody doing something really cool in Australia and you want to share that information. Well, you're probably not going to get them to come all the way from Australia to come speak at your event in whatever county, Alberta. But they might be willing to jump on a Zoom call and present for an hour, right? So these are the kinds of opportunities and the silver linings that I think we can really grab hold of through all of this experience. You also want to make sure that attendees have the opportunity to network. So, as we said, we're encouraging you to participate in the chat and that kind of thing, provide poll questions, any of those kinds of tools. And if you can personalize the attendee experience in any way, do it. Even just calling people out and mentioning them by name can be helpful. Also, you can share a lot of these resources much more easily than you could even with in-person events. So take advantage of that. Make sure that you have social share buttons attached to all of your content, your posters and your web links and all of that kind of thing. And don't be afraid to physically ask people to share and invite a friend. People will almost always do something when asked specifically. But if we're kind of expecting that they will just think to do it, they might not. And then share within the extension community the things that are working for you or not working for you. And so one of the questions later on is how we can actually sort of facilitate that networking like within our own group. One of the things that we have set up is a Slack account. So those of you that were on the call last week will be familiar with what Slack is because we went over it, but it's basically kind of like an MSN Messenger kind of thing, just a chance for people to share casually. I just put that in the wrong thing. Share casually any kind of industry news or whatever. So I just shared the invitation link. If you're interested in joining, please do. Yeah. And the other thing we were going to mention is that when you are sharing these resources, because rural connectivity can be an issue, the more we can reduce that barrier, the better. So making things streamable so that they don't have to actually download the content will make things faster and easier for them to access, and providing a smaller resolution version. So YouTube often will automatically do an HD and a standard definition version, but if not, make sure you check that box. And I think probably most important for all of us in the next little bit is to just experiment, right? There's going to be some wild and crazy ideas that come out. And I think now is exactly the time to unleash every crazy idea you've ever had and see if it works, because when else are you going to get an opportunity like that? So try a couple different formats. Try things internally within your own organizations, maybe. Share what works, and don't assume that you know, right? So I've heard a lot in the last couple of weeks having these conversations, people who are saying things like they don't think that their farm audience will jump on board some of these online things. And yet other people, like Ken, who sort of got the ball rolling, noted that the first time he saw a smartphone was in the hands of an 85-year-old farmer. And I think that speaks volumes. Farmers are super resilient people who are used to figuring things out. So even if they haven't used these tools before, what I'm finding through our work at Alice is most of them are willing to at least try, right? But ask them for that feedback and adapt as needed. So if you are hosting webinar kinds of things, we just some best practices is to send their agendas in advance so people kind of know what to expect, and give them 2 or 3 time options to join if you do want people to join live. Mute people like we've done here. If I just previous to this call had to set my 3-year-old son up for preschool on Zoom. and nobody was muted, and it's a bunch of 3 and 4-year-olds. You can imagine how chaotic that would be, and it reminded me why mute all is such an important button on Zoom. That, like I said, that moderator makes all the difference in the world. Practice ahead of time. One note on that is this is new for a lot of us, and I don't think it's easy, even for people who are used to doing these kinds of things. So having a friendly face that you can just kind of practice and feel a little silly with is really valuable. Catherine and I are both open to being that face if you want somebody on the other line, just to test, practice delivering your webinar, or test out some of the host features, test your polling, test your muting, all of those kinds of things. We're happy to do that. You can just get in touch with either of us. Or potentially somebody in your office would be willing to do that too. And aside from that, even friends. Before we started doing these webinars, this particular Zoom platform was new to me. So as soon as I got Zoom, I set up a call with my best friend and I said, let's watch a movie together, but I'm also going to make you sit through a poll and stuff like that. And she helped me test it, and it was great. So use whatever resources you have. Also consider breaking material into multiple shorter calls, and making sure that there's a call-in option as well for those who are having internet issues. And don't forget that there's humans on the other end of the line. Even if we aren't there in person, we're still people. So having some kind of an icebreaker or a check-in question to get people talking and feeling more comfortable can be helpful. Picked a pretty hard one today, but I threw it in the chat box anyways. But they can be really helpful, especially in smaller groups when you're doing a go around. I think at my last sort of group meeting, I used just a check-in question like, what's everybody binge watching on Netflix? It can be something completely silly and unrelated to work, but it just kind of gets those juices flowing. Making sure everybody gets a chance to talk. That might not be applicable for webinars. When you have a large number of people, that can be really difficult. I find 4 to 6 seems to be the best number of people for actually having a discussion. But, it's not any different than trying to facilitate a group in person, right? You're always going to have those quiet people that you have to call out and specifically ask, hey, what do you think about that? And you're going to have some that just won't shut up. Using those polls is another really great way to engage people without sort of putting them on the spot. And I mentioned earlier that unmuting yourself as a way of signaling that you want to talk can be a useful tool as well, to guide who would like to speak next. So that's great. I'm seeing chat in there, so that's great. And this was all about coming up with the silly insider tricks that really do help. Kind of said before how awkward it is trying to deliver any kind of presentation, even in the best case scenario in person, it can be difficult. But if you're trying to deliver a presentation and you're essentially talking to yourself for an hour, that's really, really daunting, and it's so awkward. It's a little bit better, like on Zoom, I'm seeing Laura kind of smile, and that's helpful. It's reassuring. It lets you know that you're kind of on the right track. But especially if you're doing a conference call where you don't have any kind of feedback and everybody's muted and you feel like you're talking to dead air, really difficult. So having somebody to talk to, even if that's like your spouse or your kid, you tell them to sit and stay and smile at you every now and then, or your dog, or if you don't have anybody like that, a teddy bear works just as well. And it feels ridiculous, but it actually feels less ridiculous than talking to dead air. So that's my insider tip. And I think we've kind of beat this to death already, but record everything if you can, because it will provide a lot of benefit to you in the future, or it could anyways. And if you haven't recorded it, you don't have that option. If you have, you can always delete it if you're finding it's not of value. Most of this like webinar kind of softwares out there now have built-in recording functions, but there's also a bunch that you can use just on like your browser or built into your computer. So QuickTime is usually on most Macs. Loom and Snagit are both available online, and they're really easy. But the thing is, when you're recording, you do want to make sure that you note that you are recording. So for those of you who may have joined us late, we did mention that earlier, but we are recording this webinar. If you have any issues with that, please let us know. And it's also a good tool for self-evaluation. It can be a little embarrassing, but when you listen back and realize how many times you say, at least that might be the case just for me. But, and again, your online events are no different than your in-person events. You want to make sure that your content is interesting and actionable. If an attendee can leave your webinar and do something immediately afterwards, you're going to have much better takeaway from that. So even if you're talking about something big, big in scale, if you can come up with like that one little piece that they can do today, you'll have much better recall of the information that you've provided. So including some kind of a call to action is great. Like maybe that's click your link to start your EFP or whatever the case may be. And provide some kind of benefit. So that might be really interesting content that snags people's attention and they really want to tune in. I mean, a lot of people don't necessarily want to tune in to learn about soils, but they might tune in to learn about, oh man, I can't think of good examples right now, but you know what I mean. Think of something that they're really going to want to learn about. It might not necessarily be your goal out of the session, but if you can work in one of those really interesting pieces, then hopefully you can get your information in there as well, if it's a little bit less sort of exciting or sexy to the general public. You could also entice people to join by doing a certificate, like hey, I attended this, something that they could include in their professional development sort of books, or enter them to win a draw. You know, if we are taking budget away from lunches and stuff like that, maybe we have budget somewhere to do a draw for a $20 Tim's card or something like that.
We just had a question in the chat. So after you're finished the presentation, does something come up then that asks you to save the recording?
So that's a good question. It depends on the software that you're using. Because we're doing this via Zoom, it's set to automatically record into a folder on my computer. You can also have it record up to the cloud, but I found my cloud space filled up after one recording, so that didn't work so well. But if you're using things like Loom, which is another tool that I've really liked, you just sort of set it to record and press stop when you want it to stop. And then it gives you options actually to like trim your recording too. So like if you want to cut off the preamble part where you're just kind of waiting for people to join, or if there was maybe a sensitive topic that was discussed that does need to be kept like more internal or something, you could cut those out and all of that kind of thing. So you have a lot of control over that. Hopefully that answers the question. Trying to build consensus if that's sort of one of your goals. I know a lot of our extension work, or not a lot of it, but some of it this year was supposed to be doing focus groups and things like that. And to be honest, I don't really know how we're going to do those yet, but in doing a little bit of research, I came across a couple of different tools. So I have not used these. I can't give them any kind of a personal recommendation, but I thought they were kind of neat, so quickly mention them. Synthetron is a crowdsourcing tool out of Belgium, I believe. And essentially it works by running a focus group. So you do it all together in live time. It's all chat based. And then their moderator and algorithms take that all back, sort through it, and then they're able to come out with like keywords and decisions and consensus that they've built out of it. So it seems kind of interesting. And Othello is a Canadian version, a little bit different. It was more along the lines of decision making. So one of the examples I looked at was funding decisions. So if you had a group of people that were deciding on grants that you're going to give out through your organization, you could plug in all the information about the grants that the grant applications that you have, and then your funding criteria, and it'll kind of automatically figure out for you, given your feedback on each grant, like given each person's feedback, where they should rank. And then you can play around with things like if you decided one criteria was more important than another or something, you can play with those and it will automatically do that rejiging. So it looks a little interesting too. But again, I have not used it. So great, going back to Amy's earlier point of how do we actually tell people about our outreach options? How do we get in front of them as an audience? You can partner with other agencies to share your information in their e-news or their podcast or whatever. And don't afraid to be asked to be featured. I think most of us in the extension world are really collaborative, and I'm seeing a lot of offers to help lately. So I think there's a lot of appetite for that. And if you can make the content as plug and play as possible so that they don't have to do a lot of work to convert it into their format, there's a better likelihood that they'll be able to share that with you. And right now, some companies might be facing business interruptions, so it might be a good time to ask them to kind of sponsor through information sharing. So an example might be an offsite water, like a solar company that isn't able to be out there installing things right now. They might be willing to share information about Alice projects that use solar watering systems to sort of set the stage for new customers when things get back online and they're actually able to deliver their services again. So, you know, we've talked a lot about webinar kind of format events just because people are fairly familiar with them and kind of seem to think that that's the option to do with remote outreach. But there are other options out there or ways to make this kind of outreach fun. So we're going to share some wild and crazy ideas. They may or may not work. And I would encourage you to think of your own wild and crazy ideas and feel free to share those in the chat. Like this is brainstorming time, guys. This is our chance to get wacky. So one is a no travel conference, right? One of the disadvantages to conferences is that they're always happening in some place cool that I can't really afford to go to. I don't have funding, that kind of thing. A no travel conference is kind of perfect. You just live stream your seminars just like you would at a regular conference. People can send in comments either via a platform that you're hosting it on, or via a Twitter hashtag, or however you want to do it. These conferences usually have a lower carbon footprint because nobody's traveling, and they can involve experts from anywhere. Like I said, bring in that expert from Australia or Serbia or wherever. If there's something really cool that you want to hear about, this is your chance. And it's also your chance to leverage maybe some of those high interest speakers through collaboration. So you might have somebody who has is in really high demand as a speaker because they have a really interesting topic, and they might not have been that interested in coming out and giving a presentation to 10 people, but they might be willing to give one to 100 people. So maybe they wouldn't come to your watershed, for instance, but they would come give a presentation, or they would come online to give a presentation to all the watersheds in Alberta if we collaborated. Similar kind of idea, spinning off of things like TED Talks, where they do these short little mini topics. They could be like testimonials, tend to be a little more inspirational in nature, and they're easily shareable. Like, people really want to share them because they have a great message. And it could be as simple as a smartphone video. You know, if you have a really engaging producer out there, why not ask them to just film something quickly on their phone and create a little series out of that. Oh, let's go to a lunch and learn, right? Lunch and learns are fun, but they've become a little bit stale. So do something simple, like change the name, call it a desktop picnic. That sounds a little more fun. Yeah, I'll bring my picnic over to my desk and listen to somebody talk about soils. I don't know why I'm picking on soils today, actually. I actually love soils and think soil biology is really interesting. Watch party. If you have something that you think people would be interested in watching, whether that's a film or documentary, it might be something that is readily publicly available, in which case there's things like Netflix parties, they're calling them, that kind of thing, or you can do a watch party on Facebook. There might be some issues with if you're doing them as a public event, you may not have the rights to that, so you'd have to look into the individual content that you're trying to share. But with your own content, you could absolutely do a watch party where you're encouraging everybody to watch together, and then you're facilitating some kind of discussion to go along with that. Of course, it would be not Boss Baby, the screenshot from Netflix, but something that is applicable. So within Alice, just before all of this happened, Mountain View County celebrated their 5-year anniversary with Alice, and they had done an event at the movie theater in Olds where they screened The Biggest Little Farm and Guardians of the Grasslands, and it was really really well received. So you could do something like that, but online.
And on that note too, we had a few discussions yesterday about some other ideas as well. So one thing that an organization that I work with is doing is we're having speakers kind of pre-record their TED Talks, and then we're going to present them online. We can all stream it at once, and then after the panel will be available on Zoom for Q&A after. So sort of a different way of doing an event. And then we also had talked about having everyone watching videos and then coming together on a platform to discuss the videos as well. So kind of like a book club for information too.
Yeah, it's a great. There's so many options and spin-offs of these kinds of ideas. So really encourage those creative juices to get flowing. Speaking of creative juices, the artists of the world have probably been embracing this whole crisis better than anybody. And one of the neat things I'm seeing is live concerts. You know, some of these big names, Brad Paisley, Keith Urban, Backstreet Boys, Elton John, they're all streaming concerts from their living rooms. So why not do something like that? I dub this the farmhouse sessions. If you have a local band or a local musician or artist, it doesn't even need to be music. Maybe it's somebody who just has a skill, like they're, I don't know, a painter or something, that people would be interested in seeing. This is again a way of like creating some like sexy content to share your material alongside. Not that your material is not exciting. I don't want to make that clear. But just sort of building in and trying to draw in that audience that you wouldn't normally reach. So, you know, have something like the band, but then share your information during their intermissions. And then a great low-key option is to host a virtual happy hour or coffee date or tea party, you know, call it whatever is appropriate for you. But it's a great alternative to doing that one-on-one outreach. So, you know, just like you would say to somebody, hey, let's grab a coffee for networking or something like that. Hey, let's do a virtual coffee date. It can also be great for low-key group settings. So again, smaller groups, like probably under 10 is best for these kinds of things, but you can use all sorts of different tools for this, and a lot of them are free, like Google Hangouts. And Catherine mentioned sort of the book club idea after viewing some kind of content. That content might indeed be books. You could have recommendations for books of interest that have to do with the topic that you want to discuss. Maybe there are even audio books. And then you give people a certain amount of time to view or read that content, and then you get back together and have some conversation related to the topic that you're hoping to do extension on. And it's a good way of just building that ongoing engagement with your target audience. So even if it's not necessarily getting at your exact extension goals, but if you're keeping that contact going with people, it might actually be fairly relevant. And virtual field trips or virtual talent shows. I know at Alice we do a lot of field tours and demonstration sites and that kind of thing. I don't see why those need to stop. The producers just need to go out there with their smartphone and show off their projects. You could compile the videos into some sort of a series. And it's a chance for the producers to show pride and enthusiasm in the projects that they've done, and hopefully inspire others to do similar kinds of work. And the other thing I like about this is it's a chance to do some behind the scenes tours. So you might have projects that are difficult to get a group of people out to, maybe because of where they're located. It's an hour horseback ride into the site or something like that. Or maybe there's biosecurity issues, like you can't pull 50 people into the chicken barn or something like that. But you might be able to get that one person with the camera in there and do some behind the scenes tours. People are also pretty desperate, I think, right now for their nature breaks, especially with the closure of the parks and things like that. So this is a great chance for us to step in and actually just provide a little bit of community benefit too. We can use our projects, especially you know, those of us who are working on the environmental side of things. Use your projects to provide some of that nature therapy, and while you're doing it, share a little educational tidbit. Can be as simple as like this GIF video or GIF, I never know how to say it, of rain falling on a wetland, but maybe you have a voiceover of something educational. Get creative. Guided tutorials too, if you're handy or if you have somebody who is maybe installing something for their project or whatever the case may be, film it, give people a chance to watch live, maybe even participate live, like something like this where it's wildlife habitat amendments, like bird boxes. You could set it up where you send out all of the materials in advance and any sort of pre-instructions, and then you work on it together just by everybody sort of setting up their smartphone or whatever in their garage while they're assembling these together. And a lot of people still, even after having these conversations, are worried that some of their producers are not going to be able to access online content at all. That's totally reasonable, and I can definitely think of some people who just never are going to sort of jump on that bandwagon. So can we go a little bit old school? Maybe we can snail mail them a DVD of the recording that you did for your online audience, and then they're still able to access that content in a way that they're familiar with. You could even do a VHS if you had the appropriate technology. And carrying cards. Who doesn't love getting a handwritten note in the mail? I talk to one of my coworkers every day, and that's fine, but she's one of those people that likes to send handwritten cards, and every time I receive one, it just makes my day, and I'm like walking on air for a week afterwards. So why can't we do that with us, our producers, right? Or with our audience? You might not be able to send them out in the hundreds, and reach the masses that you would like to with your extension. But if you had a handful of people that you were really hoping to make a good connection with this year, this might actually be a good option. It's pretty hard to ignore somebody that's taken the time to write you a personal letter. And just generationally, a lot of the people that we're trying to reach out to are from the generation that they're used to writing letters and stuff, and they might appreciate that effort. So it also shows that we care. So it was kind of inspired by an idea coming out of a lady in Edmonton who was doing community postcards and just writing her name and number on the back saying, hey, I'm here if you need groceries, whatever, let me know. So and make the most of your time. Some of us are finding more time on our hands with less travel and less in-person events. Some of us not. But if you do happen to have extra time, it might be a great time to work some of that back burner stuff off of your project plate. So things like fact sheets or brochures, one-pagers, animated explainer videos, all of those kinds of things. Now might be the time. And the thing is, this year, you might not reach all of the audience that you normally would for extension, but you might reach new audiences, and you might have a chance to create some of this lasting content that will have a benefit for many years. So taking advantage of all of those pieces can be really helpful. If you are doing things like infographics and stuff, they are really helpful. Like they say that a high quality infographic is 30 times more likely to be read than a text article. And a lot of the software required for this is freely available and really easy to use. I personally really like canva.com for any kind of graphic design work. But that said, not a graphic designer. Actually really terrible at art. I have no taste, no style whatsoever. So me sitting there struggling over trying to make an infographic, I might spend 8 hours trying to do something that a graphic designer would do in 10 minutes, right? Luckily, there's a lot of freelancer sites out there, and there's a lot of people right now on those sites really desperately kind of looking for work. So it might be a great cost-effective thing to do, is just portioning out those little mini projects. And there's lots of sites to help with that. Fiverr I've used before. There's Freelancer, Upwork, People Per Hour, all of those. And just let people know that you're open to these kinds of connections. If you have a Skype name or something, you could add it to your email signature. I'm seeing a lot of people holding space for conversation. So if you have a group of, let's say, producers or a group of extension staff that do want to have discussions on an ongoing basis, you could just say every Tuesday from 11 to 12 o'clock, we're going to hold the space open. Whoever joins, and you can have casual conversations that way. Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Laura.
Sorry, my son is playing online games with his friends, so I said, I am now live, so people hear you if you start yelling with your friends. Working from home. All right, so measuring and evaluating your online learning events. I just thought I'd give you some things to consider, and then a couple of quick tips that are sort of related more to the survey design and delivery portion. Lots of this, a lot more detailed information is provided in that tip sheet that Catherine will send out following this event. But some, top of mind things to consider is really start thinking about your survey if you want to sort of measure and evaluate your online learning. Think about it in advance and take some time to identify your important information needs so that you're asking questions and people are responding to those questions, and it'll give you that information that you're actually going to use, because their time, like everyone's time, is quite valuable. So you don't want to be just asking questions for the sake of asking questions, but have an idea of how you're going to use that information and what value it'll bring to you. So you might want to think about if you need some information on participant preferences. If this is the first time you're kind of doing something like this, well, is there a preferred time that they like to meet or not? Maybe a preferred platform that's easiest for everyone. As Christine even said, if they're using FaceTime, then use FaceTime. But you got to ask kind of what their preferences are so that you have that understanding. And then you might want some feedback on the participant experience and how that went for them, and that'll help you improve the session moving forward. Also, you might want to get some improvement feedback, maybe some feedback on how you've delivered your presentation or the content of your webinar online learning event. And this is also an opportunity to think about what kind of reporting requirements do you have. So if this is something that you're receiving funding to deliver, well, what are your funders really interested in, and what kind of questions could you ask of your participants that you could then turn around to answer some of your funders' questions and demonstrate how you're providing value to them as well. So once you've kind of done that, identified what are your important information needs, then it's time to think about the best way that you want to collect that information. So there's a couple of different strategies that you could use. You could use the in-session polls. So Christine's already done a couple of those. Not only do they keep your participants engaged, but you can also get some of that feedback information as well. You could conduct pre and post surveys, so and that can even be in the form of a poll, but just get an idea of what people's level of knowledge and understanding is of your subject, maybe before your webinar, and then you can ask similar questions after your webinar as well, and just gauge the difference in learning and understanding that might have happened. And then obviously you could create your own survey questions as well and do a post-survey session. It's best to sort of send those out as soon as you can after the session while it's still fresh in people's minds, and then they can more adequately answer your questions because they'll remember what they've just viewed. But if you send it out like a week later, as with anything, I can hardly remember what I had for supper yesterday, let alone remember in-depth sort of content from a webinar. So then after you've decided the best way to collect your information, then it's create your survey questions. And once you've done that, I can't, say how beneficial it is to actually have your survey tested with others, because a question might make sense to me, but it might not make sense to somebody else. And that is really valuable feedback to get back, so that when you actually do send out your survey to the participants, they understand the survey, they can answer your questions in a meaningful way, and then everybody sort of benefits that. But every time I've pre-tested as a survey, I always get really thoughtful comments back, and it always makes the survey better, which just makes it a better experience for everyone. So just some quick tips on how do you design survey questions, and just some things to consider. Survey questions should really use a positive language. You want to talk about what are people doing, not necessarily what people are not doing. So if you can kind of take a more positive approach to your questions, that just sets a good tone for your survey. Keep one subject per question. So I've seen in the past, this is a very common mistake, is that people double barrel questions. So they ask about their, say, knowledge and awareness of something. And well, knowledge and awareness could be two different things to people. So it's easier to just ask one subject per question. Say, what was your knowledge of this? Or what was your awareness of this? Excuse me. Another thing to consider is really use plain language. And a survey is not the time to sort of throw out fancy terminology or anything that anyone's going to have to look up in the dictionary. Just keep it plain and simple, and make it an easy experience for your survey participants. That being said, no acronyms. Try to avoid those as best you can, unless if it's maybe something really commonly understood by your audience, then perhaps you can use the acronym a little bit later on in your survey if it's a repeated thing. Clear quantifications. So what that means is, I've seen lots of questions and they'll sometimes say things like a few or many or several, and those are really unclear and fuzzy. It's best to just stick to numbers. Just say 2, 5, 10, and that can make it a lot easier to understand and respond to a question. Try to limit your mental math requirements. So that kind of goes to your clear quantifications. If you're asking, maybe you're asking participants how often they, say, brush their teeth in a month. Well, then people are doing mental math. They say, okay, well, I brush my teeth 2 to 3 times a day, and there's this many days in a month. That's too much, and it's time consuming and mentally taxing on the participants. So maybe just ask, how many times do you brush your teeth in a day or in a week? And that's a lot more simple to do in someone's head. And open-ended questions. Try to use these sparingly, and if you do use them, because they can be a valuable tool to get some, in-depth information, rather than just necessarily checking a box. But they have to be really clear and just plain and simple and to the point. And then if you're going to use them, think of how you're going to interpret those questions, and maybe think of your coding strategy ahead of time, so that when you're analyzing those questions, you can group them in meaningful ways that'll give you the answers that you might be looking for. So as I said, there is a tip sheet that we'll be sending out where lots of this information is there, but we just kind of wanted to give you, or sort of give you an introduction and kind of plant the seeds that there are meaningful ways that you can measure and evaluate your online learning to see what kind of impact that you are having with your participants. So thank you, Christine.
Thanks. Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself for some reason. Yeah, thanks, Laura. This was great. If you guys haven't experienced it yet, Laura is really great at developing survey questions and providing that feedback and stuff. So I've appreciated her help a lot with this. So do take a look at that tip sheet. It has a lot of really in-depth information, and I think will be really valuable to a lot of people. So there's a chance to just kind of openly brainstorm if you have any ideas that you want to share with the group right now in terms of something that's been in the back of your head, something, hey, this might work, or I want to try that, or what if we did this? Feel free to share them with us. I see everyone rushing to the unmute buttons. Okay, just in the interest of everyone's time, I think we'll move on, but feel free to drop any ideas in the chat box. There is no silly idea right now. They're all equally valid, I think. So, and we'll just move into another poll question. Now that we've had some of these conversations, how would you like to engage with your outreach clients this year? Let me find my poll question, get that launched. And I'm sorry, I think that this one forces you to pick one option. I didn't take Laura's advice very well, I guess. But if you want to share your, and anything else in the chat box, you're welcome to do that too. There's a question from Kelsey. Can you set up Zoom to send out automatic reminders to participants to join the meeting, like GoToWebinar does? That I'm not entirely sure about. I think you may be able to, depending on how you're sending your calendar invites. Catherine, do you?
Yeah, I was just going to say that. So the way that we set this up, we didn't send it as a calendar invite just because people were still registering until like right before. But if you were going to have kind of a cutoff date for your registration, you could send everyone an invite through Zoom, which would send a calendar invite, or probably best to send a calendar invite then as you send out your confirmation for registration. But just the way that this one worked, we wanted to not have a cutoff date or anything like that. So we just left it open-ended.
Yeah. Okay. So it looks like most people have voted, so I'll just share those results. So looks like about half of people are planning on using webinars of some kind to deliver some content this year, and social media as well. A couple people may be thinking of some out-of-the-box ideas, which is cool. And some handwritten notes or news or blog articles, so that's neat. And I see Noreen's responding to Kelsey's question in the chat box regarding reminders. And speaking with the guy at Mustakis, he said Zoom webinar add-on does send out reminders, even multiple, such as day before, an hour before, etc. So thanks, Noreen. Yeah, I think most of these platforms do have a lot of really great options. So if you play around in your settings, often you can find interesting things. So like we had some questions earlier about Laura's background, and I see Paul's got a fun background now too. Those are the kinds of things that we talked about Zoom and some of these other tools in more detail during our working from home and remote teams presentation last week. So if you are looking for more detail on those kinds of things, I would encourage you to check out the link that Catherine will send out to that previous recording. And then again, if there's things like that you want more in-depth training for, a lot of the platforms themselves offer really great training videos and stuff like that. But also a lot of us are willing and open to providing additional resources, so we can try to put together things like that. So just let us know what's of interest to you. So thinking beyond the pandemic, I mentioned how a lot of these tools are hopefully going to help us now and in the future. I think after however long of doing this, a lot of people are going to be forced into developing some of these skills, whether they like it or not. And so it may change the future of how outreach is done. in the broad scale. So I think it's prudent for us to think about how we can make the best use of our time by figuring out how we can implement changes now to get us through this, but in a way that it's going to provide positive benefit into the future. So one example is when you do get back to hosting your regular live options for events, why not set up a camera and a tripod and live stream it, or record it and provide options for online viewing as well? Because there are, as much as we're going to miss some people who will only attend live events this year, we've probably also been missing people who don't have time to attend live events and would only attend an online event as well. So hopefully that by learning some of these skills, we'll actually be able to access a broader demographic. And then you can use some of these remote options too as sort of teasers to build up your audience for in-person events and build the momentum and the excitement around your events. And we might see more and more people moving to remote offices, probably not for those of us working in like municipalities and government and stuff like that, but I could see certainly some shift for some of the NGO partners and things like that. And even just within our audience as well, when they're moving to remote offices for some of their own off-farm jobs, they're probably going to be learning these skills that will filter into their extension participation as well. So, and when we do get back together in groups, I think that we're going to have some fallout from this for a while. We're going to see that people have disease ecology a little bit more at the forefront and disease safety. So they're going to want to see very visibly that they have options for washing their hands and hand sanitizer and stuff like that. They're probably going to be a little nervous about getting together in crowds or close spaces. So when we do start getting back together, I think we'll need to watch our numbers for events and things like that and make sure that we aren't causing any situation where people feel overcrowded. And it should go without saying, but if people are sick, they should stay home. That's something that we need to practice, and that's difficult to do if you're the presenter and the whole event is sort of relying on you. So thinking about those kinds of things and maybe having a plan B in your back pocket might need to be part of your event planning in the future. So open discussion. We'd love to know what resources would be helpful to you. What are the next steps in terms of this kind of outreach? Like, has this been helpful? Is there something that we could offer that would help you do your work? Is there a way we can help everybody to engage together? Catherine's going to send out a post survey with this. It's going to ask some of these questions specifically, but we also just wanted to offer the space here. If you want to share anything, you can just unmute or you can type it in the chat box. And every time I do these things, I say I'm going to figure out a way of like having Jeopardy music as a click of the button on these kinds of things, because it's always awkward. Amy says tip sheet or guidance on creating and loading things to YouTube. Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Those are exactly the kinds of things that I think we're really interested in seeing, because like that's a great example of something that's really actionable. I'm almost certain that there is somebody in our extension world that has that knowledge at our fingertips and could easily make a tip sheet to share. So, and where we can share those kinds of pieces of information, again, we have that Slack channel, but we're also looking for how we can set up that community of best practice. Like, is there a central repository, like a website or something like that, that makes sense to store some of these pieces of information? So, and a tip sheet on FOIP and privacy issues that we need to be aware of. That's a great suggestion. Having a conversation very similar yesterday in terms of FOIP around using Zoom accounts and things like that. So maybe we can find a FOIP expert. And tips on how to edit videos or make effective videos for extension. Yeah, that's a great tip too. Okay. Great, well, feel free to keep them coming, and you can always reach out to Catherine or I individually too, and we can sort of collate all of those suggestions too. And Noreen says, if live questions is an option, I'd like to discuss webinar series to replace full day in-person events. Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
So some of you, I don't think anybody on the call, at least not the names that I can see, are part of the Southern Alberta Grazing School for Women Committee, but one of the things that we've decided to do, possibly, I mean, unless the world changes back to normal, we know we're not doing the in-person grazing school. So if we are, then great, but we're assuming we're probably not going to be able to, and yet we want to cover quite a lot of the content. And so what we've been talking about doing is actually doing a series of webinars, because it's 2 days of content, and we obviously can't shove it into 1 or 2 hours, nor do we want to hold that many webinars back to back for 2 days in a row. People aren't going to sit at their computers. So we've talked about trying to do a webinar series of some kind, which would allow people to attend. Maybe the first one would be on when we'd already preset the school, because everybody was going to be available anyways, and the other ones would be some other sequence, but also recorded, because then you can't expect people to make your repeat times, like maybe you have one a week for 4 weeks or whatever. I guess I'm just curious about other people's experience, frequency, time of day. We are also dealing, of course, entirely with agricultural women, and so recognizing that, you know, the rural quality of internet and stuff is an issue, and time of day is an issue with their kids still doing school. That'll be done in the summer at least. You know, things like the technology challenges that many of them are facing already, obviously, and just upload speed and like that. So yeah, I'm just curious if anybody's already thinking about that or has done that, particularly with rural audiences, obviously, and just has any comments.
So Noreen, I think you hit on something that we've already been discussing with the Northern Grazing Schools, and deciding not to host, but having these webinars available. So I think one thing we looked at was our website, and using it as a housing spot for directing people to even online events that are coming up, making sure the ladies know how to touch base there. And then we can use that as kind of a launching point to get us to the next step, which is the webinars and those kinds of things.
Thanks, Amy.
Yeah, I can think of a couple successful examples too. So, I think it's the Prairie Conservation Action Plan does Prairie's Got the Good Weeks. I think it's usually February or March. It just happened not that long ago, but they do it basically every day for a whole week over the lunch hour. They run a webinar series, and it seems to be fairly well attended. People seem to like they remember to tune in every day, because it is kind of compressed. And I wouldn't necessarily throw out the idea that people won't sit at their computers all day and participate in like a conference style thing either. I know, completely unrelated to our world, but I run a haunted house, and during all of this, like the big haunt convention that happens in the US, they're all canceled right now. So last weekend and the weekend before, they got everybody together and hosted a virtual conference, and they were very well attended. And we actually had probably more people participating that wouldn't have participated in a live conference, just because they didn't have any travel and stuff like that. So myself included. I wasn't going to St. Louis, but I could jump on Zoom. So again, it's like, don't throw out some ideas until you give them a try, because you just don't know.
Amy's asking about recording attendance. So for webinars, you can kind of see who's online when you're on the webinar, but then for tracking later, if you put it on like YouTube or something, it will show you the views. So that's kind of how we've been keeping track of our webinars.
Yeah. Yeah. Are there any other questions? I'm just recognizing that we're at time here, so. Okay, so just really quickly, this is kind of a first pass thing, so let us know if there's anything we can do to improve these sessions or new things. Catherine's going to send out that resource.
Yeah, I have everything kind of ready to send just about. Once this recording is available, we will send it out. So I'm going to be sending out that link to Slack as well as the recordings, along with a couple tip sheets. So we've got a few there, and then also we'll try to download this presentation as a PDF too for you to have available as well, and a survey too. So you can test out and see how well we did developing a survey with Laura's help.
Sounds good. Yeah, and doing all of this working from home remotely and stuff is a little bit challenging. So just a reminder, if you need somebody to talk to, there's lots of people out there, including us. So thanks everybody who contributed their time and energy and talents to this. It's been a really big group effort and kind of snowballed into a lot more than we were anticipating. So I have my contact information up there if you have any questions, and you should have Catherine's from just registering for this. And maybe Laura, if you're interested in sharing yours, maybe we can include that with Catherine's email out. Okay. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for your time. We really appreciate it. Feel free to continue to chat away if you're interested.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Great day.